Hello, my name is Diana Ulrich, and I will be talking to you today about the movement against the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for sterilization of poor, minority, Native American, and Puerto Rican women in the 1970s. History of forced sterilization. Sterilization abuse is when a woman does not know that she is being sterilized. Sterilization can be found back all the way to 1907 in the United States. The government had the right to sterilize the insane, feeble-minded, and those with diseases that were dependent on the government. The women did not have to give their consent for any kind of sterilization. And the government could also sterilize those who could not regulate their own reproduction. Misinformation was commonly used, and reversible procedures. Women were told that if they had the procedure and then decided to have another child, they could have the procedure reversed. Buck versus Bell, 1927. Pachowski states that in 1927 the Supreme Court upheld the Virginia state sterilization laws. This led to increased sterilization worldwide. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' reaction to the outcome of the case was that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So it was surprising to hear a Supreme Court judge stating something like that. The women's movement of the 60s, the women's rights movement of the 60s brought to light concerns over sterilization and abuse on women. We're going to go further into the types of abuse on women, but right now we're going to go into eugenic boards. In the early 1900s, the eugenics program was established. The United States was hoping to perfect the gene pool, a society without crime, helplessness, mental illness. The Eugenics Board hoped that if the poor, minorities, and mentally ill people were kept from having children, then all of society's problems would disappear. The Eugenics Board is review petitions for sterilization. The petitions came from the government or a private agency, and sterilization was used on unwed mothers, mentally disabled, and the poor of the communities. A select board is selected under the Eugenics Board. Pachowski stated if the country was working under eugenics, then the poor, minorities, epileptics, manic depressives, prostitutes, alcoholics, homeless, and criminals were targeted. Native American women. Many Indian women were sterilized without their consent in order to control the population. Indian Health Services from 1916 to 1970, Native American women were told that the surgery was reversible, to find out later that it could not be reversed. And the HIS doctors sterilized 25 to 50% of the female population from 1970 to 1976, no matter the age of the female. If she underwent a medical procedure, the doctor would sterilize her. Even if she had an appendectomy, they would sterilize her while she was under anesthetic. The Government Accounting Office, the GAO, conducted an investigation on the use of experimental drugs and sterilization on the Indian reservation. April 30th to November 6, 1976, the report was released. It did not verify that sterilization on the Indian reservation had been coerced, but it did not necessarily say that the regulations had been followed. And a halt to sterilization of young women. August 2nd, 1973, area doctors received a notice that there was a temporary halt to sterilization of women under the age of 21. So they were protecting women under the age of 21, but there was no protection for the women 22 and over. Black women, common surgical procedures. Women would go into the hospital for a procedure, like an appendectomy again, and they were sterilized. Women would be given, who gave birth, would have a C-section, would find out later on that they were sterilized. In North Carolina, 1929 to 1974, 7,600 women were sterilized. 40% of them were black women. A 1973 case of racism and sterilization abuse involving the Ralph sisters. The Ralph sisters, Katie, Minnie Lee, and Mary Alice, ages 17, 14, and 12. The family was receiving government assistance, and so they felt like they needed to do exactly what the government told them to do. Katie was given a series of the Depo-Provera shots. She was used as a guinea pig to see what kind of things would happen to her from the shot. Renee Lee and Mary Alice were given 2 ligations. Their parents thought they were going in for routine inoculations, and they gave them 2 ligations. Loss of government funding. Most women were threatened with the loss of their government funding if they did not comply, but due to the Ralph case, guidelines were set up for using federal funding on sterilization. Latino women. These women, I think because this was happening in Puerto Rico and not the United States, even though Puerto Rico is a part of the United States, people weren't aware of really what was going on over there. Puerto Rican women in the United States and in Puerto Rico. In the 30s, the government of Puerto Rico decided that the problem that was being faced on the island came from overpopulation. So women were considered cheap labor, and therefore they were sterilized. They would, if they had babies, they wouldn't be able to work, so they sterilized them. Women would get a day off of work, so their friends were jealous of them for getting that day off, so they would go and be sterilized. In 1968, 1/3 of the women of childbearing age had been sterilized in Puerto Rico. The only thing that the women had to do was ask the governor if they could be sterilized, and there was no waiting period. If he said yes, they could go. They took them right away and sterilized them. They didn't want them to have time to think about what they were doing. And the operation, they would go house to house, getting women to go in for the operation, and they wouldn't tell them that it was anything permanent. Experimental trials of birth control pills. They go to Puerto Rico, and not only with birth control pills, but with other experimental drugs, and use them on these women. 3 deaths were caused because of the women taking the pill. California 1970s forced sterilization program was against Mexican women and the poor. The programs were established to target Mexican women and to get them to have less children. The concept of this was the birth rate equal to the death rate. Mexican women were given consent forms in English instead of Spanish and were told to sign them, and so they did, not knowing what was going on at the time. United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW. The HEW was created on April 11, 1953. These guidelines were established for women under 21 years of age and for those who could not give their consent when it came to sterilization. The HEW published guidelines for sterilization procedures. Women had to wait 72 hours after signing the consent form. Women could not lose their welfare benefits for not signing the form, and women had a right to change their mind about the procedure even after they had signed the form. The Health and Hospital Corporation, HHC. The HHC was the overseer for the city hospitals. They played an important part in the monitoring of sterilization practices. The HHC hospitals had to offer counseling to those women who opted to be sterilized, and counseling sessions would be given in the tongue that the women spoke, and the paper would be given to them in the language that they spoke and read. Public Law Number 37. The New York City Council on April of 1977 passed Public Law Number 37. The HHC guidelines became the law of the city. Both private and public facilities had to comply to the guidelines. What made Public Law Number 37 unique was that it also included men as well as women in the regulations, so no longer could they go into the mental institutions and sterilize the men, and no longer could they go into the jails and sterilize the men. They had to get their consent from here on out. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this, and look into it more because there's so much more on it. Thank you.